Apple recently released the M4 MacBook Air, thereby completing their lineup of M4 Macs and bringing balance to the force. Whether you want a laptop, a stationary, or a tablet, you can now get whatever you want with an M4 chip. Unless you want an overpriced cheese grater. But if you're eyeing the MacBook, you might be wondering which one you should get. Do you need a Pro? Should you buy refurbished? How much RAM and storage do you need? Well, I'm here to answer all your questions, so let's get into it. There are timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead to a certain section. Let's talk about it. So, buying a MacBook might seem like a pretty simple concept at first, but once you start getting into the different configuration options, including which type of chip to get, which screen size, how much memory and storage, and so on, it quickly becomes a bit of a jumbled mess. And that's because there are actually a grand total of 155 different ways you can configure your M4 MacBook. And that's not counting the extra options for what kind of charger you want or any additional software such as Final Cut Pro or Logic, which Apple also offers on their store. This also means that you can end up spending anywhere between just over $700 to just over $7,000. But don't worry, Uncle Alex is here to help. I don't know why I called myself that. Anyway, I'm going to do my best to help you figure out exactly what it is you need. And I'm going to do it with the help of nature's sexiest friend, science.
Experiment.
Science. So, I've made these spreadsheets. Oh yeah, just look at them. So factual. What I'm saying is, I've gone through every iteration of every possible upgrade so I could get an overview of all the different MacBooks you could get. But before we look at all the different options in the M4 lineup, I think it's worth asking yourself, do you need a brand new MacBook or do you just need a MacBook? So the first thing you need to figure out is whether it's worth buying a new MacBook straight from the store or if you can make do with a refurbished one. And to answer that question, you first have to consider the different types of refurbished laptops you can buy. Basically, you can either get a machine that's a few years old at a pretty significant discount, or you can buy what is essentially a brand new model while saving a few bucks. For the first category, I think it's only worth considering older models if you know you're not planning on pushing these machines too hard. The performance increase in the M4 in both CPU, GPU, and memory bandwidth compared to the M3 and M2 means that you'd be losing out on a whole lot without saving too much. However, if you genuinely just need a computer to browse the web, do some writing, or watch content or anything like that, then yeah, buying an older refurbished model is a good way to save some money instead of paying for extra power you don't need. As my financial advisor always tells me when it comes to not paying taxes, if I don't need it, I'm not paying for it. And I'm sure he knows what he's talking about. Now, the other kind of refurbished MacBook you can get is one that's basically new but at a reduced cost. For example, here's a base model M4 MacBook Pro, 16 gigs of RAM, 1TB SSD with the nano texture display. As you can see here from my spreadsheet, this would cost you $1,949 new. But if you buy it refurbished, you can get it for just $1,659, meaning you save almost $300. Of course, there are drawbacks to this as well. You obviously can't spec out the machine to be exactly what you want. You can only buy what they currently have in stock. And although Apple supposedly does an amazing job on their refurbished products to the point where they feel practically new, they're technically not really new, meaning you don't know where they've been before, and some people get a bit weird with their Macs. And finally, there is also the option to buy one used from someone, which can lead to you finding a great deal. Generally, Macs retain their value pretty well, but it could still be a lot cheaper to buy a used one privately. But again, you don't know exactly where they've been, and in that case, you often don't get it with any type of warranty, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so if you've got your mind set on getting a new M4 MacBook, then the second biggest question you have to answer is, do these pants make me look fat? I don't know, I'm just a little self-conscious about these. Oh yeah, and do you really need a MacBook Pro, or is the Air good enough? Look, I made a whole video testing whether the M4 MacBook Air could handle video editing or if it would throttle. Spoiler alert, it did great. And I made another video following that where I basically proclaimed the M4 Air to be the new Pro. So I think you can kinda guess where I stand on this issue. But if I had to sum it up in one phrase, it would probably be like this. If you think you need a Pro, you don't. But if you know you need a Pro, you do. Basically, the M4 MacBook Air is significantly overpowered for the kind of workloads the vast majority of people use their laptops for, and it even does extremely well with a lot of the heavier tasks that previously would have required a Pro to run smoothly. Hell, I edit all my videos on an M4 Air with 16 gigs of RAM, and I'm not saying my workload is the heaviest, but I have been known to make some pretty special effects sometimes. That's not to say there's no reason to get a MacBook Pro. Of course, if your workload is significantly demanding, then the addition of having fans on your computer as well as a potentially more powerful processor could be a huge benefit. And if you want to do any gaming, yeah, macOS isn't exactly built for that, but the MacBook Pros definitely would be more capable in that regard. Although again, the Air certainly ain't no slouch. And of course, it's perfectly fine to buy a Pro just because you want to, even if you don't technically need it. If you're someone that cares deeply about image quality, or someone that works outside in direct sunlight, in a place that actually has sunlight, or someone who wants to have more ports or better speakers on their laptop, then the MacBook Pro is an absolutely excellent option. Maybe one of the best laptops ever made. But again, as I've said before, the vast majority of people out there certainly don't need one. Alright, it's time to talk about size. Now, I think I speak for everyone here, especially all the women, when I say that size obviously doesn't matter.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
But when it comes to laptops, then it kinda does matter. The Air comes in either a 13 or a 15-inch version, while the Pro comes in a 14 or 16-inch version. So I guess the obvious thing here is, first you figure out whether you want an Air or a Pro, and then you decide on whether you want a small or a large one. But it's not quite that simple. You see, while the 15-inch version of the MacBook Air will only cost you an extra $200 compared to the 13-inch version, making it an absolutely viable option no matter how else you want to spec out your MacBook, if you want the bigger Pro, you can only get it with certain chipsets, meaning you're going to have to fork out at least $2,500 for it, which is $900 more than the base MacBook Pro. So really, the bigger Pro is only a viable choice if you already want something pretty high-end. Then there's the issue of portability. Obviously, if that's your main concern, then the Air is a great choice. But what you might not know is that even at 15 inches, the Air is still incredibly portable and is in fact still slightly lighter than the 14-inch Pro, while also being 25% thinner and having a display that's 16% larger. Meanwhile, the biggest Pro compared to the biggest Air is about 40% heavier, 46% thicker, and only has a display that's 12% larger than the Air. So basically, the 16-inch Pro is a very big laptop, while the 15-inch Air is a very slim laptop and still has a pretty big display. As someone who specifically went for the MacBook Air because of the affordability and portability of the 15-inch version, I highly recommend it if you're interested in a larger display. For anyone going for a Pro, I'd say most people should stick with the 14-inch version. Next up, let's figure out which chip you should get in your MacBook. If you're getting a MacBook Air, this should be pretty easy. The base model starts at $999 with a 10-core CPU and an 8-core GPU, which you can choose to upgrade to a 10-core GPU for just $100. And you really should not do that. Because for just $100 more than that, you not only still get the extra 2 GPU cores, but you can also choose to simultaneously double your storage, increase your memory to 24 gigabytes, or get a bigger laptop. And again, for the vast majority of people, the 8-core GPU will be absolutely fine if you're not planning on making any other upgrades anyway. So really, that 10-core GPU option for $1099 is just kind of pointless, to be honest. Moving on, let's talk about the MacBook Pros. Essentially, these come in 3 different varieties: the base model MacBook Pro, the Pro MacBook Pro, and the Max MacBook Pro. Not quite as confusing a lineup of names as the Xbox has, but still a solid effort on Apple's part. First off, the base model MacBook Pro is essentially the exact same chip as what's in the MacBook Air, the 10-core GPU version, just in the body of a MacBook Pro. So if you've already decided that you don't want the excessive power of a Pro or Max chipset, but you just want the MacBook Pro for the higher quality display or the fans or whatever it is, then this is the version you should get. Again, unless you absolutely know that you need a Pro chip, then this will be more than enough for you. And of course, one extra bonus of the MacBook Pro is the option to get the nano texture display, which is a special coating which reduces glare by quite a lot. And people's opinions on this seem to be pretty split, with some absolutely praising it while others think it's terrible. So my piece of advice here is pretty simple. Go to an Apple store and look at it in person. It's the only way to determine whether that upgrade is worth it to you. Then there are the Pro and Max chipsets, and hopefully it should be clear to you by now whether or not you need these. But if you do, then you should also note that each of them come in several different versions. The M4 Pro chip comes with a 12-core CPU and 16-core GPU starting at $1999, while there's also a 14-core CPU and 20-core GPU option starting at $2199. And honestly, if you're already at the level of knowing you need an M4 Pro, then I'd say you might as well pay the extra $200 to bump it up to the more powerful version. Mind you, there's also the 16-inch version, which only comes with the 14-core CPU and 20-core GPU configuration. And then there's the M4 Max. And look, this thing is just ridiculously powerful, but also priced to match, starting at $3199 for the 14-core CPU, 30-core GPU version, while an extra $500 takes you up to the more powerful 16-core CPU and 40-core GPU version, which also comes with an additional 12 gigabytes of RAM. Again, if you really need this thing, it has to be because you're doing some absolutely insane work. Like maybe you're editing hour-long 8K 60 RAW videos while doing some 3D modeling and playing Cyberpunk 2077 on max settings on an external monitor at the same time. Because honestly, I don't know what else you'd use all this power for. And if you don't know what you'd use it for either, then there are easier ways to get yourself into a crippling amount of debt, like developing a gambling addiction, investing in crypto, or buying a desk mat from GroveMade. Alright, you've picked a chipset and size that suits you best, so what about storage? Well, due to how costly these upgrades are compared to buying something like an external SSD, I'd say that in most cases, it's not worth the upgrade. The only exception to this is if you're planning on doing something bigger like gaming or video editing on the M4 Air. In that case, upgrading to 512 gigabytes might be worth it. But since the Pros already come with 512 gigabytes to start and the Maxes come with 1 terabyte, there are very few cases where it would make sense to upgrade beyond that. All that being said, I did actually go for an M4 Air with 1 terabyte of storage, but I do have a very particular use case for it. But unless you know you really need it, sticking to the base storage or upgrading to 512 gigabytes at most is all you need. And finally, how about RAM? Well, Apple actually increased the amount of memory you get with the cheapest version of each MacBook, with the Air now starting at 16 gigabytes of RAM and the Pro starting at 24. And I will say, I've been pushing my Air with 16 gigs of RAM pretty hard, and it hasn't so much as stuttered even once. But if you're the type of person who loves to do several big things at once, it might be worth it to upgrade, as unlike with storage, you can't add on to the memory later on. Just keep in mind that it can get pricey pretty quickly. Upgrading the RAM on your M4 Air will cost you $200, but again, that initial upgrade also gives you 2 extra GPU cores, which makes it a pretty good deal overall. But on the more powerful chips, those same upgrades will push the cost up by quite a lot. I think most people can make do with either the starting amount of RAM or at most upgrading to the second tier. So 24 gigabytes of RAM on the Air or base model Pro, 48 gigabytes on the M4 Pro or Max. And I don't see why anyone would ever need 128 gigabytes of memory unless you're my wife, who somehow remembers every single stupid thing I've ever said or done, of which there are quite a lot. Alright, I think that just about covers it. Of course, if you have any other questions, feel free to hit me up in the comment section below. I do try to answer everyone, even if it takes me a couple of days sometimes. I'll also leave a link to the spreadsheet I made in case you want to use it to get an overview of the upgrades you're considering, or if you want to read it to your child as a bedtime story. Although I don't see how they'd ever fall asleep listening to something that riveting. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe for more tech related content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.